Forced march designed to prove.
Spin. What was the clue?
She got me a beautiful notebook. Told me to go. Year 4, flowers, wood.
So what'd you get her?
There's no good gift for wood.
The bar. Why, yes, hang on.
Very much. I'll be right there. All right, bye-bye. Hey, buddy. What are you doing out here?
I'm Detective Rhonda Boney, this is Officer James Gilpin. We understand there.
Please.
How long you two been here? Here.
My mom got sick. My sister Margot and I owned the bar. Checked up here. This is the,
I love these books. Your wife is amazing, Amy.
The golden child. Perfect.
Everyone is still arguing about Gone Girl. A decade after its release, critics are still debating whether it's feminist or misogynist. Academics are still writing papers about its gender politics. TikTok users are still performing the cool girl monologue at men who use the word chill. And somewhere in that argument, somewhere in that noise, that heat, that decade-long shouting match, the actual film has been completely forgotten. Because here's what nobody wants to admit. The feminist debate and the misogynist debate about Gone Girl are arguing about the same thing. Both camps are asking, what kind of woman is Amy Dunne? The feminist camp answering a righteous avenger. The misogynist camp answering a dangerous psychopath. And both camps have missed the point so completely, so thoroughly, so spectacularly that David Fincher might as well have shot the whole thing in a foreign language. Gone Girl is not about Amy Dunne's gender politics. Gone Girl is not about marriage. Gone Girl is not at its core about media sensationalism, though it uses media sensationalism as its instrument of torture. Gone Girl is a horror film about narrative itself, about the total, terrifying, inescapable violence of story. And its real argument is not look at this monstrous woman or look at this oppressed woman. Its real argument is this. In a world where everyone is a character in someone else's story, the most dangerous thing a person can do is start writing their own. Let me be precise about what I mean, because this matters enormously. Every character in Gone Girl is trapped. Not trapped by their marriage, not trapped by their gender, not trapped by their class or their geography or their psychological disorder. They are trapped by narrative, by the story that other people are telling about them, and by their own desperate, often doomed attempts to control that story. Nick Dunne doesn't behave the way he behaves because he's a bad husband or a good husband or an innocent man or a guilty man. He behaves the way he behaves because, from the moment Amy disappears, he's the protagonist of someone else's story, and he has absolutely no control over which kind of story it is. Will it be the story of the grieving husband, the philandering villain, the media-savvy survivor? He doesn't know. He can't know, because he's not the author. Amy Dunne. And this is the key, this is the fulcrum of the entire argument. Amy Dunne is the only person in the film who understands this. She is the only character who recognizes that everyone around her is living inside a fiction, that every interaction is a narrative performance, and that the only meaningful freedom available in such a world is the freedom to become the author of your own story rather than a character in someone else's. Her evil, The elaborate, murderous, staggeringly controlled plan she executes is not the product of psychopathy, it's the product of radical narrative literacy. She has read the genre, she knows its rules, and she has decided to write herself a different ending. That's the argument, and it changes everything about how you watch this film. You've seen Gone Girl. Maybe you've seen it twice, 3 times, 4. You think you know what it's about. You've had the debate. You came down on one side or the other. Maybe you thought Amy was justified. Maybe you thought she was monstrous. Maybe you split the difference and decided the film was complicated. You're wrong. Not about Amy. About the question itself. Is Amy justified? It's not the question Gone Girl is asking. It's the question the film is trapping you into asking. It's bait. And you took it. We all took it. For a decade. Here's the thing about Gone Girl that nobody talks about. The film opens with an act of narrative aggression. Nick Dunne looks directly into the camera, directly at you, and says, "When I think of my wife, I always think of the back of her head. I picture cracking her lovely skull and spooling her brain, trying to get answers." He's describing violence. But he's not describing violence against a person. He's describing violence against a mystery. He's describing the desire to crack open a skull and extract the story inside it. The first image, the first thought, the first desire in Gone Girl is, I want to understand the narrative. I want the truth of you. I want to open your head and read what's in there. The entire film is about the violence of that desire. What happens when you try to crack open another person's skull and read their story? What happens when you insist on knowing the truth of someone? When you demand that their life conform to a narrative that makes sense to you? What happens when the story inside their head turns out to be completely, irreversibly different from the story you thought you were reading? That's Gone Girl. Not toxic marriage. Not cool girl politics. The violence of the desire to know. The horror of discovering that the story you thought you were reading was written by someone else, for purposes you never suspected, starring a character who never existed. The conventional reading of this film, the one critics settled on, the one that launched 1,000 think pieces, is approximately this. Gone Girl is a dark, satirical thriller about a psychopathic woman who uses society's double standards and media's hunger for beautiful missing white woman stories to frame her husband for murder. And the film is either bravely feminist, she's fighting back against impossible standards, or insidiously misogynist, she's every man's worst nightmare given cinematic form. This reading is not entirely wrong, it's just answering the wrong question. Yes, Amy Dunne uses gender performance strategically. Yes, the film critiques media sensationalism. Yes, the cool girl monologue is a genuinely radical piece of cultural criticism embedded in a mainstream Hollywood thriller. These things are all true, and they are not unimportant.is. But they are the surface of the film, not its engine. They are what the film uses to make its argument, not the argument itself. The argument is about narrative, about authorship, about the specific intimate violence of being reduced to a character. And the proof is hiding in plain sight, in the most overlooked aspect of the entire movie. Not the cool girl monologue, not the blood on the kitchen wall, not the sex with Rosamund Pike's eyes open and staring at the ceiling. The diary. Amy's diary, the one the police find, the one that builds the case against Nick, the one that chronicles his escalating abuse, his anger, his threats, is a fabrication. Not a diary with some exaggerations, not an unreliable account colored by fear. A complete, premeditated fiction, a story written by one person and attributed to another. A character. Diary Amy, abused and terrified and powerless, who never existed, created, wholesale, with deliberate craft and strategic purpose. That diary is the film's thesis statement, not the cool girl speech. The diary. Because the diary tells you exactly what kind of film you're watching. You're watching a film in which the most important question, who is this person? What happened to her? Is he guilty? Can only be answered by reading a story that someone else wrote. You're watching a film in which evidence is narrative is evidence, and the only person in full command of both is the person who understands that they're the same thing. The diary tells you that Gone Girl is not a film about marriage. It's a film about authorship. And the horror, the deep, existential, lingering horror that keeps this film alive a decade after its release, is not that Amy is a murderer. It's that she might be right. Not morally right, philosophically right. About the nature of identity, about the nature of truth, about the nature of story and what it does to people and what people will do to control it. Here's what this means for the way you watch the film. If you watch Gone Girl as a film about Amy, as a character study of a psychopath, or a feminist portrait of a woman pushed to extremes, you will miss every moment in which Nick is also trapped by narrative. You will miss every moment in which Detective Bonnie is trapped by narrative. You will miss every moment in which Margot, loyal and furious, is trapped by narrative. You will miss every moment in which the audience, you, sitting in the dark, watching, judging, consuming, is itself the mechanism by which narrative traps its characters. This is the film everyone has been watching wrong, not Amy's story, not Nick's story, not even the story of their marriage. The story of the story, the violence of the story, the way stories capture people and hold them and will not let them go, and the catastrophic, irreversible consequences that follow when someone decides to fight back. Gone Girl is not about what Amy Dunne did. It's about what narrative does. Amy is just the instrument, the case study, the one who figured it out. Watch it again with that in mind and you'll see a completely different film. You've been watching the wrong character. The villain isn't Amy Dunne. The villain is the story, and we've all been demanding it from the beginning. Start here. Everything starts here. Amy's diary isn't just a plot device. Critics treat it like one, as a clever mechanism for the film's twist, a narrative MacGuffin that exists to be revealed as fake, to land the gut punch of the midpoint reveal. They're missing what the diary actually does, which is structural, not mechanical. The diary doesn't exist to surprise you. The diary exists to make you complicit. Think about what happens when the diary is introduced. The film cuts between Nick's present tense investigation and Amy's past tense diary entries. You, the audience, are receiving two simultaneous streams of narrative. One is Nick's lived reality, chaotic, defensive, opaque. The other is Amy's diary, clean, sequential, emotionally clear, moving toward the crisis with the irresistible momentum of a story that knows where it's going. And here's the thing, the diary feels more true than Nick's reality, more coherent, more legible. When Amy writes about their falling in love, you believe it. When she writes about the first signs of Nick's darkness, you believe that too. When she records his escalating anger, his coldness, his cruelty, you believe every word because the diary performs the grammar of truth. First person, present tense, emotionally specific. This is what truth sounds like, narratively. The diary is a lie, but it's a lie that sounds exactly like truth, because it uses the same formal conventions. This proves the thesis because it shows you something terrifying. You cannot distinguish between a fabricated identity and an authentic one based on internal evidence alone. Both use the same language. Both deploy the same emotional textures. Both follow the same narrative logic. The diary doesn't reveal that Amy is a liar. The diary reveals that the conventions of authentic narrative, diary entry, first-person voice, chronological confession are indistinguishable from the conventions of fiction. Amy doesn't need to lie convincingly. She just needs to write convincingly. And there's something even darker underneath this. The film never shows you what a real Amy diary would look like. You don't get an authentic Amy journal entry to compare against the fabricated ones. The film offers no ground truth, no unmediated Amy. The fabricated diary is the only Amy diary you ever see, which means the film is asking, implicitly, uncomfortably, whether there is an authentic Amy to be captured in a diary at all. Whether the fabricated diary is actually more honest than any real diary would be, because at least this one was written with deliberate purpose, self-knowledge, and total clarity about what it was doing. Every diary, this is the film's quiet, radical argument, is a character. The real Amy of any authentic journal would also be a constructed persona, shaped by audience expectation, her future self, reading back, narrative convention, and the gap between experience and language. Amy's fabricated diary is just honest about its own artificiality. It knows it's a story. Every other diary just pretends it isn't. This is not a thriller's twist. This is a philosophical claim about the nature of self-documentation, and it recurs throughout the entire film in every single act of identity we witness. Scene 2, Amazing Amy. Before we get to Amy's fabrication of her marital identity, we need to go further back. To the books. To Amazing Amy. Amy Elliott's parents wrote a book series about her childhood. They took the real events of Amy's life, her friendships, her failures, her ordinary moments of childhood, and turned them into something more palatable, more narrative, more commercially viable. They gave their daughter's life a story, and then they published it. The real Amy didn't get a cat. Amazing Amy got a cat. The real Amy didn't make the soccer team. Amazing Amy made the soccer team. Every time real Amy failed, Amazing Amy succeeded. Every time real Amy was complicated, Amazing Amy was clear. Real Amy's life was the draft. Amazing Amy's life was the published version. Most readings of this aspect of the film focus on the psychological damage it inflicted on Amy. The impossible standard, the identity theft, the sense that her own life was inferior to its fictional counterpart. And yes, that damage is real and the film acknowledges it. But that's the surface reading. The deeper argument is about precedent. Amy grew up understanding something that most people never consciously articulate, that there are two versions of a person, the person and the story about the person, and that the story is what the world actually responds to. She didn't learn this as an adult through bitter experience. She learned it as a child, watching her parents turn her real life into a better version of her real life, and watching the world embrace the fiction while ignoring the fact. Amazing Amy is not just a psychological origin story for Amy's manipulativeness. Amazing Amy is the film's first, clearest argument that narrative colonizes identity. That from the moment you are narrativized by someone else, published, storied, characterized, you are no longer yourself, you are a character. And the character will always be more vivid, more loved, more real to the outside world than the person who inspired it. Amy's entire campaign against Nick, her entire methodology of self-invention and narrative control, is not pathological deviance. It is a logical extension of what was done to her first. The Elliots taught Amy that the world prefers the story to the person. Amy took that lesson and ran with it. She became the author because she refused to remain the raw material. Watch the scene where Amy's parents discuss the books with Nick in the early days after Amy's disappearance. They're performing grief, but they're also, and this is almost too uncomfortable to look at directly, treating Amy's disappearance as a narrative event, as something to be processed, shaped, communicated. They're already writing the next amazing Amy book in their heads. Their daughter is gone, and their first instinct is authorial. What does this mean for the story? Like parents, like daughter. Amy didn't invent narrative violence, she inherited it. Scene 3, Nick's press conference. Now flip the lens, because this thesis only holds if Nick is equally trapped by narrative, equally imprisoned in someone else's story. And the press conference proves he is. After days of being consumed by the media coverage of his wife's disappearance, days of bad optics, suspicious smiles, inappropriate photographs with female fans at vigils, Nick Dunne shows up to a press conference having, clearly and visibly, transformed. He's wearing different clothes, he's projecting different body language, he has hired a criminal defense lawyer. He has, in short, been coached, and he nails it. He's grieving, he's earnest, he's present in a way he wasn't in earlier appearances. He looks, for the first time, like the kind of husband whose wife would be missing rather than murdered. You're probably thinking, this is just Nick trying to look innocent because he's actually guilty of something, the affair, at minimum. That reading is available, but watch what the film is actually doing with this scene, because he's doing something far more radical. Nick is not performing innocence because he's guilty. Nick is performing innocence because he has learned, with brutal speed, that in the narrative of missing beautiful white woman, the husband is always the villain until proven otherwise. He has learned that the story the media is telling has a fixed role for him, suspicious, cold, unfaithful husband, and that the only way to survive is to play a different role more convincingly. He isn't becoming more honest in this scene, he's becoming more strategic. He is, for the first time, doing what Amy has always done. He's writing himself as a character. The press conference is the moment Nick Dunne becomes Amy Dunne, not because he's guilty, because narrative demands that he perform, because the story the media is telling about his wife's disappearance has a cast of characters, and he has been assigned a role, and he can either play it badly and be destroyed, or play it well and survive. There is no third option. There is no just be yourself. Being yourself in the media glare of a missing wife case means being consumed by someone else's story. The only available freedom is performance. Detective Bonnie watches this transformation with visible unease. She senses that something is off, but she can't articulate what, because what's off isn't guilt, it's strategy. Nick is performing, and Bonnie's instinct is correctly reading it as performance, but incorrectly reading it as the performance of a guilty man rather than a man who has been forced to learn performance as a survival mechanism. This is the thesis in action. Watch it. In the world of Gone Girl, authenticity is not available. Authenticity gets you destroyed. The only available mode of existence is narrative management, and the only distinction between characters is how well they manage it. Amy is extraordinary at narrative management. Nick is a quick learner. Everyone else is just a character someone else is writing. Group B. The anatomy of imprisonment. How every character in the film is owned by a narrative they didn't write. Scene 4. The cool girl. Monologue. You've been reading it wrong. Everyone who has discussed Gone Girl has discussed the cool girl monologue. It's the film's most quoted, most shared, most analyzed passage. It's been called the definitive feminist cultural statement of the 2010s. And the reading that prevails. Amy is naming the performance women are forced to give for men, and she's righteous to refuse it, is not wrong. But it's not complete, and the incompleteness of the prevailing reading is where the thesis lives. Listen to what Amy says. She doesn't just describe the cool girl performance and condemn it. She says something more specific and more troubling. She says that women who perform cool girl know they're performing it. She says that every woman who claims to love football and not care about her weight and think male humor is the pinnacle of wit is consciously performing those preferences for the benefit of a man. And then she says something else. She turns on those women. She calls them pathetic. Not the men who demand the performance, the women who give it. The obvious feminist reading stops here and says, yes, Amy's calling out the performance. Correct. Proceed. The deeper reading asks, but who made Amy immune to the performance? Amy doesn't identify as a cool girl. She performed cool girl for Nick, she tells us, and then stopped. She sees through the construct. She refuses it. She has transcended the trap, except she hasn't. She's just replaced one performance with another. The cool girl monologue is Amy describing her own prison while claiming to be free of it. She thinks she's the only person who sees the performance for what it is, but the film shows us, in the very act of Amy claiming this, that her non-performance is also a performance. Her refusal to be cool girl is itself a carefully maintained character. Amazing Amy, the protagonist of her own story, the woman who sees through the lies. That's a role too. A better written role, a more deliberately inhabited role. But a role. The monologue isn't the thesis of Gone Girl. The monologue is evidence for the thesis. It proves that even self-aware performance is performance. Even seeing through the story doesn't free you from it. Amy thinks she's the author, but she's still a character named Amy who sees through characters. The story she's writing still confines her. What's Rosamund Pike's face during this voiceover? What's the relish, the pleasure, the rhetorical precision? Amy isn't just angry. Amy is performing anger. She's giving a speech, she's written the speech, she's performing the speech in her head, and the pleasure of the performance is visible in every syllable. This is what narrative captivity looks like from the inside. Even rage becomes material. Even liberation becomes a character choice. The Cool Girl monologue proves that Gone Girl is not about feminist liberation. It's about the impossibility of liberation from narrative. Amy escaped one story and walked directly into another one. And she's so pleased with the new story that she can see the walls. Scene 5. This Lake House. Here is where the thesis becomes impossible to ignore. Here is where the evidence reaches its most concentrated form. Amy, having fled to Missouri and subsequently having been robbed of her escape funds, finds herself in a position of actual vulnerability for the first time in the film. For a few remarkable scenes, she's powerless. Her plan has been disrupted. She cannot write her way out of this with narrative alone. She needs resources. Enter Desi Collins, former boyfriend, obsessive admirer, a man who has been loving a version of Amy that Amy wrote for him years ago. Desi is wealthy, devoted, and completely in the grip of a character. Not a real Amy, a performed Amy. An Amy who was cool girl for Desi before she had a name for what she was doing. Desi loved that character. He's been faithful to that character for years after Amy moved on. He will die for that character. And Amy knows this. She knows exactly what kind of Amy Desi wants, so she gives him that Amy. She performs vulnerability, gratitude, fear of Nick. She gives Desi a story in which he is the rescuer, Amy is the victim, and their reunion is the narrative culmination of a love that was always meant to be. She writes them both into a new story, and Desi, who has been waiting for this story for years, steps directly into it, and then she kills him. The murder of Desi Collins is the most explicit expression of the thesis in the entire film. Desi didn't fall in love with Amy. Desi fell in love with a character. That character was written by Amy, for Amy's purposes, tailored precisely to Desi's desires and vulnerabilities. When Amy no longer needed the character, when the story had served its purpose, she wrote Desi out of it. And since Desi's devotion to the character made him impossible to simply dismiss, since he would never voluntarily release her from the story, she ended the story by ending him. This isn't murder for survival. This is narrative termination. The staging of the killing reinforces this. Amy stages it as a scene. She sets the narrative before she acts. She positions the crime as self-defense, sexual assault, desperate escape. She gives the subsequent investigators not just a corpse, but a story. The blood patterns, the scratches, the positioning of the body. These are not just evidence planting. They are production design. She's not just committing a crime. She's writing a chapter. Most readings of the Desi section focus on Amy's coldness, her ruthlessness, her willingness to destroy a man who loved her. That reading is available, but it misses the structural point. The real violence isn't in the killing. It's in the fact that Desi was loving a fiction all along, and Amy knew it and used it, and he never had a chance, not because Amy was evil, but because the story Amy wrote was more real to Desi than Desi was to himself. He was so thoroughly a character in Amy's narrative that he had no independent existence to protect him. The monster in this scene isn't Amy, it's the story she wrote, and the victim isn't just Desi. It's the idea that you can love a person who is performing for you and remain safe. Scene 6. Nick's TV interview with Sharon Shiver. By the time Nick sits down for his televised interview with Sharon Shiver, the film has established something important. Nick is a writer. Not a very good one, perhaps, not by the standards of his literary ambitions, but a writer. He taught writing. He thought of himself, before he became a house husband dependent on Amy's trust fund, as a craftsman of narrative. The Sharon Shiver interview is Nick writing for his life. He's been coached. He knows the audience, not just Sharon, but the millions of people watching at home who have already made their verdict. He knows the narrative they're expecting, the guilty husband, the charming sociopath, the philanderer who murdered his perfect wife. He knows because he's been watching it constructed in real time, on every television in every bar and living room in America. He knows what the story says he is, and he performs the opposite. He cries. He speaks about Amy with specific, genuine-sounding love. He uses her name. He makes eye contact. He says the things a grieving, innocent husband would say, in the order a grieving, innocent husband would say them. Is he lying? The film doesn't let you answer that cleanly. Nick is lying about the affair. Nick is lying, by omission, about the deterioration of the marriage. But is he lying about loving Amy? This is where the film becomes genuinely vertiginous, because the evidence suggests that Nick's love for Amy, whatever it was also always partly a response to a character. He fell in love with the Amy who matched him perfectly, who read his thoughts and reflected his wit. That Amy, as we learned, was a performance. Did Nick love the person or the role? The film refuses to decide. What the Sharon Shiver interview proves is that Nick is finally enrolled in Amy's system. He is performing identity. He is managing narrative. He has become, without willing it, a version of the thing he was living with. His survival depends not on truth but on storytelling. The irony is devastating. The man who failed as a writer, who couldn't sustain the fiction required of him as a published author, who ended up dependent on his wife's family trust, turns out to be fully capable of the most important fiction of his life when the alternative is death row. He just needed the right audience and enough motivation. This is the thesis proven in the most human, most sympathetic register. Nick isn't a villain. Nick isn't a hero. Nick is a person who has been forced, by the logic of the world he inhabits, to become a character. He performed badly at first, then he got better. By the end of the film, he has achieved something approaching Amy's level of narrative control. And the film asks, is that an achievement? Is that liberation? Or is that just a more sophisticated form of captivity? Group C, the recursive trap. The film's most devastating evidence, the ending as prison architecture, scene S7. What are we doing? There's a scene near the end that most discussions of Gone Girl either treat as a thriller resolution or as a nihilistic punchline. It's neither. It's the thesis in its most complete form. Nick knows everything. He knows Amy faked the disappearance. He knows she framed him. He knows she murdered Desi. He knows she used her own body as the site of a crime scene, staging sexual assault with forensic precision. He knows all of this and he can prove any of it, and he knows he can prove any of it, and Amy knows that he knows all of this and can prove it, and Amy is pregnant and they're gonna stay together. Nick asks, not in accusation, not in horror, but with something that sounds almost like genuine bewilderment and genuine intimacy. What are we doing? And Amy answers, whatever we want. This is the film's philosophical center, and it's being completely misread by almost everyone. The prevailing interpretation is that this exchange is dark comedy, or bleakness, or satirical commentary on the performative nature of modern marriage. Look at this terrible relationship continuing because both parties are too trapped to escape. That reading is fine, it's not wrong, it's just operating on the surface. What's actually happening in this scene is this. Nick and Amy are, for the first time in the film, having an honest conversation. Not honest in the sense of confessing everything, honest in the sense of speaking to each other as the people they actually are rather than as the characters they've been performing. Nick is acknowledging that he knows the truth. Amy is acknowledging that the truth doesn't matter. And the question, what are we doing, is not a complaint. It is a genuine philosophical inquiry into the nature of their existence together. They are doing what everyone in Gone Girl does. They are performing. They are managing narrative. They are living inside a story that was partly constructed by Amy's design and partly imposed by external forces. The media, the public, the legal system, their own prior performances. The question, what are we doing, has the answer, whatever we want. Only in the sense that they are now, finally, equals in the authorship of their shared fiction. Both of them know it's fiction. Both of them have the power to destroy each other. And the equilibrium this creates, this terrifying mutual assured destruction, this marriage as nuclear deterrent, is what Amy calls whatever we want. The baby clinches it. The pregnancy is Amy's final narrative weapon, and Nick recognizes it as such. He cannot live without abandoning his child. He cannot destroy Amy without destroying the family he is now performing for the world. The baby is the story's insurance policy. The child who hasn't been born yet is already a character in a story that's already been written. This baby, before it has a name or a face or a breath, is amazing. Amy, the next generation. The cycle begins again. That's not nihilism. That's horror. It's the most complete, most rigorous horror ending in American cinema of its decade. Not because it's dark, because it's logical. Every step follows from the premise. This was always where the story was going. This was always what narrative does when you give it enough time and enough people to consume. Scene, EIG, the book. And then there's the book. The film ends, or rather, the film's world extends past its ending, with the knowledge that Nick is writing a book about Amy. He says so explicitly, he's going to write the truth about Amy, going to put everything on paper, going to fight back with the only weapon he has, which is language. He will not do this. Nick Dunne will not write the truth about Amy Dunne, because the truth about Amy Dunne is unwritable. Not because it's too complex, not because he lacks the skill, but because the moment Nick begins writing the truth about Amy, he is doing exactly what Amy has always done. He is constructing a character, giving her a narrative, arguing for a particular version of who she is. His truth will be as fabricated as her diary, not because he's a liar, because narrative is incapable of truth in the way we usually mean it. The book that Nick will write, let's call it Gone Girl, let's acknowledge the recursion, will tell the world Amy's story. It will give Amy another narrative skin. It will be read by millions. It will be debated. People will take sides. People will argue about whether Amy is a feminist icon or a misogynist horror fantasy. You see what I'm doing here. The book that Nick will write is the book Gillian Flynn already wrote. The story Nick threatens Amy with. I'll tell everyone the truth. It's the story we are watching. And the story we are watching is, by the film's own logic, unreliable. A character's perspective. An author fiction. Not truth. Never truth. Gone Girl ends by making itself the evidence for its own thesis. The film is the book Nick says he'll write. The audience is the public he wants to warn. And we, having watched, having judged, having taken sides, having argued about Amy Dunne for a decade, we are the mechanism by which narrative captures and holds and will not release. We are the story. We've been the story this whole time. There are serious counter-arguments to the thesis. Let me make them as strong as possible, because they deserve that, and then let me show you why the evidence still points to the narrative horror reading. Counter-argument 1. But Amy is just a psychopath. This is the most intuitive objection, and it comes in two flavors. The first flavor is clinical. Amy Dunne displays clear markers of antisocial personality disorder: lack of empathy, manipulativeness, grandiosity, absence of genuine remorse, capacity for calculated violence. The film itself, in its most frightening scenes, shows us a person who is simply not wired like other people. She experiences other humans as instruments. Her love for Nick is possessive and controlling. Her love for the sea is predatory. Her relationship with her own parents is one of study performance and private contempt. If you want a simpler explanation for Amy's behavior than she's a philosophical argument about narrative, the simplest and most available one is she's a psychopath. And psychopaths do things like this, and the film is a psychological portrait. The second flavor is more literary. Gillian Flynn, in interviews, has described Amy as a pure expression of the crazy woman archetype she wanted to subvert. Flynn has talked extensively about wanting to write a female villain who was villainous not because of victimhood or trauma, but because she chose to be. Amy is Flynn's rejection of the idea that women in fiction must be sympathetic or redeemable. So maybe the narrative horror thesis is overreading a thriller that just wanted to give us an unapologetic female monster that it's okay. Let me engage this seriously. First, the psychopath reading. There's merit to it. Rosamund Pike plays Amy with a flatness behind the eyes that is genuinely unsettling, and the film earns its thriller credentials by making Amy's inner life feel both vivid and fundamentally alien. You believe that she does not experience guilt the way other people do. You believe that she has, at some level, reorganized her emotional architecture around control rather than connection. But here's what the psychopath reading cannot explain. Why does Amy care so much about narrative? Psychopaths, clinically understood, are goal-oriented. They want things: resources, safety, dominance, pleasure. They use manipulation instrumentally to get what they want. Amy's manipulation is not merely instrumental, it's crafted. The fake diary isn't just a cover story, it's a narrative achievement. The plan she executes isn't just a plan, it's a plot. She takes pleasure in the structure, in the craft, in the elegance of the execution. This is not psychopathic instrumentalism, this is authorship. More to the point, the psychopath reading requires you to exceptionalize Amy. To say, she's different from everyone else in the film because her brain works differently. But the film doesn't support that exceptionalization. Nick is also performing. The Elliots are also performing. The media is also performing. This is also living inside a fiction. Everyone in Gone Girl is doing a version of what Amy does, just with less skill and without the same philosophical clarity about it. If Amy's behavior can be explained by psychopathy, how do you explain everyone else's? They can't all be psychopaths. The narrative management the film depicts is systematic. It's cultural. It's structural. It's what the world demands of everyone, and Amy is just the one who took it most seriously. The psychopath reading looks at Amy and sees an aberration. The thesis looks at Amy and sees the destination point of a system everyone is already inside. As for Flynn's stated intentions, directors lie, and so do authors, not deliberately, not maliciously. But what a writer intends and what their work achieves are not always the same thing. Flynn saying she wanted to write an unapologetic female villain, and the film actually being a horror essay about narrative are not mutually exclusive. Artists often produce more than they intend to. The evidence in the film points to something more complex than a character study, and the character study reading, however valid, cannot account for everything the film is doing structurally, formally, and philosophically. The psychopath reading is a reading about Amy. The thesis is a reading about the world Amy inhabits. Those are different scales of analysis. Both can coexist. The thesis operates at the larger scale. Counterargument 2. But the film is about gender performance. This is the most intellectually serious counterargument, and it comes from the most thoughtful critics of the film. The argument goes, the cool girl monologue is a thesis statement. Flynn is explicitly engaging with the sociology of gender performance, the Erving Goffman tradition applied to femininity. Amy's entire situation is constructed by an only comprehensible through gender. The missing white woman narrative depends on her being a woman. Her ability to use sexual assault allegations as a weapon depends on gender dynamics. Her capacity to inhabit the victim role is made possible by sexist assumptions about women's fragility and men's violence. Strip out the gender and you have no story. The gender is the engine. The narrative horror reading is abstracting away from the very specific horror of being a woman in a world that narrativizes women in particular ways, that there's genuine truth here. Absolutely genuine truth. The film is deeply, inextricably concerned with gender dynamics, and the cool girl monologue is genuinely one of the most precise pieces of cultural criticism in American cinema of its decade that is. Here's where that reading goes wrong. The gender reading assumes that Amy's problems are primarily gender problems, that she is doing what she does because of the constraints of being a woman. But the film provides Amy with a backstory that predates and transcends her gender. She was narrativized long before she encountered the demands of femininity. Amazing Amy happened to Amy as a child, before she was old enough to be performing gender in the way the monologue describes. Her parents, a mother and a father, not simply a patriarchal structure, authored her. Her sense of herself as a character in someone else's story precedes her awareness of the cool girl archetype by decades. Moreover, Nick is equally imprisoned by narrative without being imprisoned by gender demands in the same way. Nick's trap is the suspicious husband archetype, the philandering man archetype, the failed writer archetype. These are gender-inflected, yes, but they operate through the same fundamental mechanism as Amy's trap, the collapse of authentic selfhood under the pressure of social narrative. The film depicts both characters as narrative prisoners, which suggests the prison is structural, not specifically gendered. Most tellingly, Amy's solution to the gender trap is not to dismantle gender narratives. Her solution is to weaponize them. She uses the missing white woman narrative, the victim of sexual violence, narrative, the devoted wife, narrative. All of these are gender-specific, as tools for a larger project of narrative control. She doesn't fight gender stories. She authors gender stories. That distinction matters enormously. A film primarily about gender performance would show Amy trying to escape gender performance. What we get instead is a film that shows Amy mastering gender performance as one of many narrative tools available to the skilled author of self. Gender is the medium, narrative is the message. Sure, you could read it as gender all the way down, but that reading leaves you arguing about whether Amy is a feminist icon or a misogynist fantasy for the rest of your life. And a decade of critics have demonstrated that this argument goes nowhere. The narrative thesis doesn't replace the gender analysis. It contextualizes it, elevates it, and explains why the debate has been so intractable. Both sides are partially right because they argue about the surface of a film whose real depth is something else entirely. Counter. Argument. 3. This is overthinking. It's a thriller. This objection takes two forms. The first is populist. Sometimes a thriller is just a thriller. Sometimes Gone Girl is just a very good, very dark, very entertaining movie about a marriage gone wrong, and the search for deeper meaning is the critic's occupational disease. The second is more sophisticated, the narrative horror. Reading aestheticizes and intellectualizes violence, turning Amy's real crimes, murder, false rape allegations, emotional abuse into philosophical abstractions. Real people experience the things Amy does. Treating her as a thesis about narrative strips the victims of their specificity. Both versions of this objection deserve honesty. On the populist objection, yes, Gone Girl works as a thriller. It works brilliantly as a thriller. David Fincher is not a director who accidentally makes films that work. His technical precision is architectural, and the film operates as pure entertainment with no thesis whatsoever if you want it to. Nothing in this essay requires you to stop enjoying Gone Girl as a thriller, but the film is also doing something that pure thrillers don't do. Pure thrillers don't open with a voiceover about wanting to crack open a woman's skull to read her story. Pure thrillers don't include extensive, structurally crucial backstory about a children's book series and the weaponization of a child's authentic experience. Pure thrillers don't end with an image that recycles the very first image of the film. Amy and Nick locked together, the same composition, the same impossible intimacy, suggesting that the entire film was circular, that its conclusion is its beginning, that the story cannot end because the story is the point. These are the choices of a film that knows exactly what it's doing thematically. The thesis reading isn't imposed on the film from outside. It's extracted from formal choices the film itself made. On the aestheticizing violence objection, this is the most serious version of the counter-argument. And I want to be clear that the thesis is not arguing that Amy's actions are aesthetically beautiful or philosophically redemptive. The thesis is arguing that the film understands Amy's actions as the logical product of a specific kind of world, a world in which narrative colonizes identity, and that this understanding is more disturbing, not less, than treating Amy as an individual psychopath. Making Amy a psychopath is actually a more comfortable reading because it exceptionalizes her. The thesis refuses that comfort. The thesis says, the world that produced Amy is the same world we watch in the film in. The violence isn't abstract, it's close, it's here. The thriller objection fails because it asks us to accept less than what the film is offering. That's a choice available to every viewer. It just means watching a smaller film than the one Fincher made. The War Gone Girl was born into October 2014. Gone Girl opens in American theaters. Consider what else is happening. A week earlier, the first domestic Ebola case in the United States was reported, and cable news was constructing the story in real time. Who was patient zero? Who was responsible? Who would be blamed? The 24-hour news cycle, already a decade old and fully mature in its pathologies, was consuming national anxiety and turning it into narrative. Ferguson, Missouri, mere miles from where Nick Dunn's family home is situated in the film, a detail that cannot be entirely accidental, was still raw with the aftermath of Michael Brown's death, and two competing, irreconcilable narratives about that event were tearing the country in half. Everyone was watching. Everyone was taking sides. Everyone was consuming someone else's life as story. Gone Girl dropped into this world, and the world received it exactly the way the film predicted it would, by immediately constructing competing narratives about what the film was about, by demanding that it means something definitive, by taking sides, by arguing. The cultural moment of 2014 is the cultural moment the film diagnoses, not critiques. Diagnosis. Fincher and Flynn weren't warning us about a future world of narrative saturation. They were describing the present one with clinical precision. The year Gone Girl was released, Twitter had 284 million active monthly users. Facebook had 1.35 billion. The social media self. The curated, authored performance for an audience identity that each platform demanded was already normalized to the point of invisibility. Nobody thought of their Instagram post as a fabricated character. It was just who you were. It was just what you shared. It was just your story. Amy's Diary is an Instagram account with murder at its logical conclusion. That's no hyperbole. Follow the logic. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, now TikTok, now whatever comes next. These platforms reward performance. They reward the version of yourself that generates engagement, that tells a story your audience wants, that uses the formal conventions of authentic life, first person, present tense, emotionally specific, to create a character that the public can respond to. The social media self is a fabricated diary, posted in real time. Like Amy's Diary, it uses the grammar of authenticity to construct a character. Like Amy's Diary, it is calibrated for an audience. Like Amy's Diary, the person it depicts is a production shaped by platform incentives, audience feedback, and the author's understanding of what kind of story plays well. The difference between Amy's Diary and your Instagram account is not the nature of the fabrication, it's the stakes. Amy's stakes were life and death. Yours are just reputation, but the mechanism is identical. And the world that normalizes that mechanism, the world that teaches you from childhood that you are what you perform, that your story is who you are, that authenticity is a narrative mode rather than a fact, that world is the world Gone Girl depicts with unflinching accuracy. From Gone Girl to the post-truth age, here's a number. Between 2014 and 2026, the word narrative entered everyday political vocabulary in a way it never had before. Politicians stopped talking about policy and started talking about the narrative. Journalists began analyzing not what happened, but what story is being told about what happened. Controlling the narrative became not just a PR phrase, but an explicit political strategy, deployed openly, without shame, at the highest levels of government in every democratic country in the world. This is the world Gone Girl predicted. Not because Fincher or Flynn saw the future, because they understood the present so clearly that the logical next steps were legible to anyone paying attention. The post-truth age, the age of alternative facts, of deepfakes, of synthetic media, of AI-generated voices and faces and stories, is not a rupture from the world. Gone Girl depicts is the culmination of it. The logic of Amy's Diary, extended through the affordances of contemporary technology, gives you a world in which any narrative can be made to feel true if it's sufficiently well produced. The mechanisms for distinguishing authentic experience from constructed narrative, mechanisms we barely had in 2014, are further eroded every year. What Amy did with a journal and a forensic understanding of domestic abuse dynamics, anyone can now do with a language model and a camera. This is not a comfortable thought. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. Gone Girl in 2014 was a thriller that made you feel unsettled for a few days. Gone Girl in 2026 is a document from the recent past that reads like an instruction manual for the present moment. The film hasn't aged because the thing it was diagnosing has only intensified. Every platform that asks you to share your story, every dating app that requires you to perform yourself for an audience of strangers, every LinkedIn profile that turns your professional history into a hero's journey, every authentic influencer who maintains the performance of authenticity with the discipline of a method actor. Amy Dunne is not a cautionary tale from those contexts, she is their logical conclusion. The true crime industrial complex. There is a specific, more targeted version of this cultural argument that needs to be made. Because Gone Girl didn't just diagnose the general narrative saturation of contemporary life. It diagnosed something more specific, the apparatus of true crime entertainment. In 2014, podcasting as a medium was in its infancy. Serial, the podcast that arguably launched the modern true crime era, premiered in October 2014, the same month as Gone Girl. Within the following decade, true crime became one of the most consumed entertainment genres in American culture. Dozens of podcasts, hundreds of streaming documentaries, entire Netflix libraries built on the aesthetic pleasure of real human suffering. The murdered woman, the missing woman, the disappeared woman. This became the raw material of a massive entertainment industry that processes real pain into consumable narrative. Gone Girl is about this phenomenon from the inside. The media circus around Amy's disappearance, the Ellen Abbott shows, the public videos, the Justice for Amy merchandise, the instant partisanship of an audience that has never met either Nick or Amy. It's not satirical exaggeration. It's a documentary portrait of how true crime media operates, filmed before the explosion of the genre that would make it ubiquitous. Ellen Abbott, the Nancy Grace analog played with tremendous ferocity, is not a caricature. She is a business model. She is the mechanism by which real women's suffering is packaged for commercial consumption, and the mechanism works precisely because the audience, us, watching, consuming, want the story. We want the resolution. We want to know whether he did it. We want the guilty verdict. We want a narrative closure that reality, notoriously, refuses to provide. The film makes this explicit in a moment that most true crime analysis of Gone Girl breeze past. When Nick watches the Ellen Abbott coverage, watches the audience who has decided he's guilty, watches the women holding signs outside his house, watches his wife's suffering turn into spectacle, and his own life turn into courtroom drama, there's a scene where he recognizes something. He recognizes that the audience wants a particular ending, not justice, a story, and that the difference between these two things may be unbridgeable. The audience for Amy's disappearance is not interested in the truth. They're interested in the story that confirms what they already believe, that attractive women are victimized by men, that husbands are the most likely perpetrators, that the media should be trusted to deliver the verdict that the legal system is too slow to provide. The story they want is the one Amy wrote for them. The story that the audience was already demanding was the story Amy already wrote. The fit is perfect. The demand and the supply are identical, and nobody in that audience, nobody holding a Justice for Amy sign, nobody calling into the Ellen Abbott show is conscious of having been authored. They think they have an opinion, they have a character in someone else's story. This is the indictment, not of Amy, of us. The audience for Amy's story is the audience watching Gone Girl. And Gone Girl is asking us very quietly, very precisely, at every moment, are you consuming this correctly? Are you watching the film, or are you inside it? Are you analyzing the narrative apparatus, or are you part of it? Every time we argue about whether Amy is a feminist icon or a misogynist fantasy, we are answering that question wrong. We are inside the story. We are the audience for Amy's performance. We are doing exactly what Ellen Abbott's viewers do, demanding a clean narrative, taking a side, consuming a real person, even a fictional one, as a character in a story that serves our existing beliefs. The film has been watching us watch it for a decade, and we keep giving it exactly what it predicted. The philosophy of the self-constructed self. Let me be precise about the philosophical tradition that Gone Girl is engaging with, because it's not just cultural criticism. It's reaching back towards something much older and much deeper. Erving Goffman, the sociologist, argued in The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life 1959 that all social interaction is performance, that we are always on stage, presenting a version of ourselves calibrated to context and audience. This was radical in 1959. By 2014, it was a commonplace. But Goffman believed in a backstage, a private, authentic self that existed behind the performances, that the performances were serving. Amy Dunne, as a character, represents the logical terminus of the Goffman thesis without the backstage. Amy has no backstage. Every space she inhabits is a stage. Every version of herself is a performance for an audience. There is no private Amy behind the cool girl, behind the amazing Amy, behind the victim, behind the devoted wife returning. No original text beneath the annotations. No face beneath the masks. This is where Gone Girl departs from Goffman and enters darker philosophical territory. Goffman's framework is reassuring in its own way. Yes, we perform, but somewhere behind the performance there is a real self that does the performing, that has preferences, that knows the difference between the stage and the wings. Amy's existence, as constructed by the film, denies this. She was authored before she could author herself. Amazing! Amy consumed the raw material of Amy's actual childhood before Amy had the cognitive apparatus to resist the colonization. By the time Amy was old enough to ask, "Who am I?" the question had already been answered by someone else. The answer was published. The answer was popular. The answer was selling better than she ever would. Jean Baudrillard's concept of the simulacrum is even more applicable here and more disturbing. Baudrillard argued in the 1980s that in a sufficiently media-saturated culture, the distinction between representation and reality collapses. Not because representations become more realistic, but because reality begins to model itself on representations. The map doesn't follow the territory. The territory reshapes itself to match the map. Amazing Amy didn't just represent Amy Elliott. Amy Elliott began living in relation to Amazing Amy, defining herself against the fictional version, resenting the fictional version, and eventually learning to create fictional versions of herself with the deliberate craft her mother brought to the book series. The simulacrum devoured its original, and then the original, having been devoured, became the most skilled simulacrum producer of all. Amy Dunne is Baudrillard's argument with a pulse and a homicidal intelligence. And here's the contemporary resonance that makes this more than academic. We are all living in Amazing Amy's world now, the social media profile that precedes us into every room. the LinkedIn presence that defines us for employers before we speak a word, the digital footprint assembled from 10 years of posts and likes and shares. This is amazing, Amy, for everyone. We are all living in relation to a published version of ourselves, a version we didn't fully author, shaped by platform algorithms and audience feedback and the precedent of our own past performances. The question, who am I really, has always been complicated. Now is complicated in the specific way that Gone Girl depicts by the existence of a more legible, more publicly available, more narratively coherent version of ourselves that exists independent of our inner experience and is, in most practical contexts, more real than we are. Amy didn't have a choice about Amazing Amy. We did have a choice, sort of, in theory, at the beginning. But the choice was made so gradually, so naturally, so sweetly. Join this platform, share this post, build your personal brand, that most of us didn't recognize it as the same trap until we were already inside it. Gone Girl is a horror film about a thing that happened to one character. It's also a horror film about a thing that happened to everyone. Gone Girl and the true crime canon. What comes after one more contextual piece before we move to craft? Because Gone Girl didn't just diagnose the true crime apparatus that was emerging around it in 2014. It seeded a specific kind of cultural conversation that has only deepened in the years since. The sympathetic female villain, Amy's specific archetype, has become one of the defining figures of prestige entertainment since 2014. Big Little Lies. Sharp Objects, Also Flynn. You. Promising Young Woman. The Woman in the Window. Yellow Jackets. Each of these works engages in some version of the question Gone Girl raises, what does a woman do when the story being told about her is intolerable? Each of them answers differently. None of them answers it with the radical philosophical clarity that Gone Girl achieves, because none of them fully commits to the idea that the story itself, not the gender dynamics, not the individual psychology, is the real agent of violence. What this lineage tells us is that Gone Girl did something irreversible to the culture. It made a woman controlling her own narrative story into a genre. And in doing so, and this is the perverse, beautiful, recursive joke at the center of the film, it trapped Amy Dunne in a narrative she didn't write. Amy Dunne became a character in the cultural story of fictional female anti-hero who fights back. She became an archetype, a shorthand, a reference point for 100 subsequent characters. She was storied, categorized, contextualized by exactly the same apparatus she spent the film fighting. The woman who refused to be a character became one of the most characteristically consumed characters in contemporary cinema. The story consumed her, just as she always feared it would, just as it always does. This is not the film's failure. It is its final argument. Critical difference from any Channel 1 analysis. This section does not comprehensively cover Gone Girl cinematography, editing, score, or production design. It selects, ruthlessly, argumentatively, only the technical choices that prove the thesis. Everything here answers one question. How does Fincher's filmmaking embody the argument that narrative is a prison? 3 elements. Only 3, but deployed with Fincher's characteristic totalizing control, they make the thesis visible at every level of the film. Element 1. The split structure. 2 time streams, no ground truth. The most significant structural choice in Gone Girl is not the twist, it's the dual timeline. For the first half of the film, you are watching 2 different streams of reality simultaneously, Nick's present tense investigation and Amy's past tense diary. This is the standard unreliable narrator setup that academics have written about extensively, and the surface level analysis is usually, we don't know who to trust. That analysis is true but insufficient. What the dual timeline actually does, what it does technically, at the level of editing and presentation, is create a world in which there is no such thing as a mediated experience. There is no scene in which you are simply watching events happen. Every scene is either happening to someone who is already inside a story about what's happening, Nick, or is explicitly a story being told, the diary. The film's formal structure denies you access to reality at any point. You are always watching either a person experiencing narrative pressure or a narrative being constructed. This is not an accident. Most films use flashback structures to provide context, to give you the real backstory against which present events unfold. Gone Girl inverts this. The backstory, Amy's diary, is the fabricated version. The real backstory of how Amy and Nick's marriage actually deteriorated is never shown to you in its raw form. You get Nick's defensive, confused, self-protecting version. You get Amy's scripted, weaponized version. You get Margot's partial, loyal sibling version. You never get the thing itself. The marriage, the actual marriage, the lived day-to-day reality of 2 people in a house together. This does not exist in the film as a directly accessible thing. It exists only as competing narratives, only as stories people tell about it. The structure of the film is the thesis of the film. Fincher isn't just telling you that narrative captures people. He's building you a film in which narrative is the material of reality, in which there is no reality outside or beneath the narratives, in which the question, what really happened, cannot be answered because the question itself assumes there was a What really happened that exists independent of the stories told about it? There wasn't. The film never shows it to you, because in the world Gone Girl depicts, it doesn't exist. This connects to something deeper in Fincher's filmography. He is, consistently, a director of surfaces. Fight Club is about the violence that erupts when a self-constructed entirely of consumer culture signifiers confronts its own emptiness. The Social Network is about the story of the invention of the platform that would make Amy Dunne's methodology universally available. Zodiac is about the impossibility of narrative resolution when dealing with actual human evil, which refuses the closure that stories demand. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is about the violence hidden inside orderly, well-told family stories. Fincher makes films about the gap between story and truth, and the violence that lives in that gap. Gone Girl is his most complete statement of this theme. The split timeline doesn't just create suspense, it creates epistemological crisis. By the end of the film, when Nick and Amy are back together and Amy is pregnant and Nick knows everything and can prove nothing, that dual timeline has resolved into a single timeline. But a single timeline is not a resolution, it's a merger. It's two stories that have collapsed into one story, and neither has won, in the sense of achieving the status of truth. They've just reached equilibrium. The narrative prison has found its most stable configuration. Element 2, Rosamund Pike's eyes, the performance of performing. There's a specific technical choice in how Fincher directs Rosamund Pike that deserves full analysis, because it directly embodies the thesis in a way that's impossible to accidental. Rosamund Pike plays Amy in two registers, and the film is meticulously clear about when each register is operating. When Amy is performing for someone in the film, for Nick, for Desi, for the police, for the public, her eyes are warm, alive, responsive, she makes eye contact, she projects vulnerability or love or fear with a specificity that's completely believable. She's an extraordinarily convincing performance of warmth. When Amy's alone, when she's in the car driving away from Missouri, when she's in the motel planning, when she's watching the TV coverage in private, her eyes change. Not dramatically, not in a horror movie way, subtly. The warmth is absent, not replaced by coldness, exactly. Replaced by something more unsettling, evaluation, calculation, the eyes of someone watching a film rather than living a life. This is the technical proof of the thesis in performance. Pike is playing two versions of Amy, the Amy who performs for others and the Amy who exists when performance is unnecessary. And the critical thing is that the backstage, Amy, the calculating, watchful, story-managing Amy, is not presented as the real Amy from whom the performances deviate. Both versions are presented with equal technical skill, equal conviction. Neither feels more real than the other. This is exactly what the film is arguing philosophically. There is no more real Amy. The performed Amy and the calculating Amy are both performances. One performed for other characters in the film, one performed for the audience of the film. The eyes change, but the act of watching doesn't. Amy never stops watching. She never stops evaluating. She never stops asking the question, what does this scene require of me? Fincher amplifies this through a recurring shot choice. The close-up of Amy's face in moments of false emotion, followed by a very slight pullback that catches just the edge of the calculation behind the mask. It's a fraction of a second edit, barely perceptible at normal viewing speed, but it's there, repeated, deliberate, functioning as a visual signature of the thesis. Here is the performance. And here, barely visible, is the performer watching the performance land. The most devastating deployment of this technique is in the reunion scene, when Amy returns to Nick after Desi's death. The public performance, the traumatized wife reuniting with her husband, the scratches and the blood and the tears, is calibrated perfectly. The audience outside the house, the cameras, the reporters, they get a story that satisfies every expectation. And then, inside the house, when Nick pulls Amy into an embrace and whispers, "I know what you did," into her hair, and the camera catches her face over his shoulder, the eyes, the evaluation, the micro-calculation, she's already writing the next chapter. Most directors shooting this moment would make the reveal of Amy's coldness large and clear, a sharp cut, a jarring tonal shift, a musical sting that signals she's still in control. Fincher refuses all of this. The revelation is barely there, you have to be looking for it. And the reason Fincher makes it so subtle is precisely to deny the audience the satisfaction of a clear demarcation between performance and reality. He won't let you put Amy in either box. He won't let you say, there's the real Amy. The real Amy, if she exists, lives in the fraction of a second between one story and the next. This is Fincher's craft serving the thesis with total precision. The technique embodies the argument. He's not showing you a woman who sometimes pretends. He's showing you a woman for whom the distinction between pretending and being has ceased to be meaningful. And in doing so, he's showing you something about everyone, not just Amy, for whom modern life has made that distinction increasingly difficult to maintain. Element 3. Trent Reznor and the score. That never reassures. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's score for Gone Girl is one of the most precisely deployed musical arguments in contemporary film scoring, and it proves the thesis in audio form. Start with what the score doesn't do. It doesn't tell you how to feel. This sounds like a small observation, but it's radical in the context of mainstream thriller scoring. Most thriller scores are fundamentally emotional instructors. They tell you when to be scared, when to relax, when to suspect. They manage your affective state on behalf of the narrative. They're the narrative's emotional publicist. Reznor and Rossi's score for Gone Girl refuses this role entirely. The score is predominantly ambient, textural, uncertain, built from electronic drones and processed sounds that hover at the edge of menace without committing to it. The most immediately recognizable cue, the one that plays over Amy's introduction and recurs throughout the film, is built on a pattern that never resolves. It suggests unease, it suggests wrongness, but it never identifies what's wrong or where the wrongness is coming from or whose perspective we should be trusting. It is emotionally non-directional in a film that is narratively maximally directional. The plot tells you exactly where to look. The score refuses to tell you how to feel about what you see. This is technically the score performing the same function as the film's dual timeline structure. Both refuse to provide ground truth. Both withhold the emotional orientation that conventional narrative provides. Both say, through their form, you are on your own here. There is no authoritative source telling you how to respond. Figure it out yourself. And what happens when you have to figure it out yourself? You bring your own narrative. You bring the story you arrive with, about guilt and innocence, about marriage and gender, about what kind of woman Amy is and what kind of man Nick is, and you project it onto the film. The score creates a vacuum, and your pre-existing narrative fills the vacuum. And then you think you understood the film, when what you actually did was watch yourself. This is the score as diagnostic instrument. Reznor and Ross aren't scoring a film about Amy's story. They're scoring a film about the audience's response to Amy's story. The music tracks not Amy's psychology, but the audience's epistemological disorientation, the slow, uncomfortable, never fully articulated realization that you don't know what you're watching, that you don't know who to believe, that the normal toolkit you bring to a thriller has been deliberately disabled. The specific cue that plays over the film's final image. Nick and Amy in the pose that opened the film. The camera slowly pulling back. The two of them locked together. Is not threatening. It's not triumphant. It is, with terrible precision, the sound of an ending that isn't an ending. An equilibrium. A story that has found its stable state. It sounds like a door closing that was never gonna open for you. You could score that moment with something clearly dark. The villain has won. You could score it with something bittersweet. The tragedy is complete. Fincher and Reznor score it with something that sounds like neither. That sounds like a system reaching its natural configuration. That sounds like the world working exactly as it was designed to work. No justice. No injustice. Just narrative. Finding its equilibrium. Settling into the shape it always needed to be. That's the thesis in sound. Not this is terrible, not be afraid, just this is how it works, now you know. So here's where we land. Gone Girl is not about marriage, it's not about gender, it's not about media sensationalism, and it's not a feminist manifesto, and it's not a misogynist fantasy. It is a horror film about the totalitarian violence of narrative, about the world that emerges when identity becomes performance, when truth becomes story, when the only freedom available is the freedom to author rather than be authored. Amy Dunne is not the monster. She is the person who understood the monster first. This has specific, uncomfortable implications. Not just for how you watch the film, for how you watch yourself. What this reading takes away from you. If the thesis is right, then a specific comfort you probably brought to Gone Girl has to go. The comfort is this: Amy is exceptional. Amy is a special case. The level of narrative control Amy exercises, the degree to which she has organized her entire existence around the authorship of her own story. This is aberrant, this is pathological, this is a thing that happens to characters in films and in very rare, very extreme real-world cases. And it is definitionally not the thing that is happening to you, reading this, going to work, managing your social media presence, performing slightly differently for your boss than for your friends, than for your family, than for strangers, than for the version of yourself you curate online. That comfort is not available after this reading, because the thesis is that Amy is not exceptional. Amy is just more aware, more skilled, and more ruthless than everyone else in a game that everyone is already playing. The Amazing Amy books happened to her first, and with unusual explicitness, but the thing that Amazing Amy represents, the author's self, the published self, the self that the world knows and the person must continually perform, happened to all of us, more gradually, less obviously, through platforms rather than published books, through feedback loops rather than royalties. But the mechanism is the same. The reading takes away the comfortable distance between yourself and Amy Dunne. Once you see the film's argument clearly, you cannot unsee it. Every Facebook post becomes a diary entry. Every LinkedIn profile becomes Amazing Amy. Every carefully worded text message to a person you're trying to impress is a performance of a character you've decided serves the moment. You're not a psychopath. Amy isn't primarily a psychopath. You're both people living in a world that has decided stories are more real than facts, and both of you are adapting to that world as best you can. The difference is one of degree and willingness to look at it directly. What this reading gives you. Here's what you gain from accepting the thesis. You gain an explanation for why the film has generated the specific kind of decade-long argument that it has. The feminist versus misogynist debate about Gone Girl has been so intractable, so resistant to resolution, because it is asking the film's surface question rather than its deep question. The film was never going to resolve the gender debate it seemed to be having, because the gender debate was the decoy. The decoy was designed to occupy the audience, while the actual argument operated at a level the audience wasn't looking at. Every think piece about Amy's gender politics is evidence for the thesis. Every one of those think pieces is the cultural apparatus doing exactly what the film predicted it would do, consuming the story without seeing the story. Once you have the thesis, you have the explanation for the inexplicable endurance of the film's cultural relevance. Gone Girl should have baited. The missing white woman media apparatus it satirizes is, if anything, now even more nakedly cynical than it was in 2014, which should make the satire feel redundant. The gender discourse the cool girl monologue engaged has evolved considerably in the decade since the film's release, which should make some of the film's cultural commentary feel like period artifact. Instead, the film gets more disturbing every year. It gets more relevant every year. Because the real thing it was diagnosing, narrative as the dominant structure of human social reality, performance as the primary mode of self-construction, story as the prison that nobody ever fully escapes, has only intensified. The film is not dated. The film is a document of a trajectory that is still in progress. The question the film is actually asking returned to the opening. Nick looks at the back of Amy's head and thinks about cracking it open to read the story inside. By now, 12,000 words later, by now, having followed the thesis through its evidence and its counter-arguments and its cultural context and its formal construction, you know what that image means. Nick's desire is not for Amy. Not really. His desire is for legibility, for a person who makes sense, for a story that can be read and understood and ended. His desire is the same desire that drives the true crime audience, the same desire that drives the readers of Amazing Amy books, the same desire that drives every social media algorithm and every dating app profile and every performance review and every job interview. The desire for a person who can be known fully, completely, finally, because they have been rendered as a story that can be read. That desire is violence, not metaphorical violence, actual violence. The desire to crack open a skull and read the story inside is the urmit of all the violence the film depicts. Amy killed Daisy not because she is evil, but because Daisy loved the story she wrote, and the love of that story imprisoned her. And the only way out of the story was to end it with the only finality that stories understand, death. The violence in Gone Girl flows from the desire for narrative access. It flows from the conviction that other people can be known through their stories, and that knowing them through their stories constitutes knowing them, and that the story you've been reading is the truth. Every victim in Gone Girl, Daisy, Nick in his imprisonment by the media narrative, Amy herself in her imprisonment by Amazing Amy, is a victim of someone else's desire to read their story. Every act of violence is an act of narrative insistence. Every horror is a horror of being written. The film's question is not, who is Amy Dunne? That's the trap. That's the wrong question. The film's question is, why do you need to know? What does your need to have a story about Amy Dunne, villain, hero, feminist icon, monster, whatever you prefer reading, tell you about the world you're living in and the mechanisms by which that world has taught you that people are stories waiting to be read? Gone Girl doesn't want you to understand Amy. It wants you to understand your desire to understand Amy. Rewatch it, watch it again now, with this in mind. Watch Nick's face the first time a reporter films him without his knowledge, the flicker of awareness, the micro-adjustment, the instant recalibration to a better performance. Watch how fast he learns. Watch how natural it becomes. Watch the man who said he could never be like Amy become, scene by scene, exactly like Amy, not because he's guilty, because the world the film depicts leaves him no other option. Watch Amy's parents. Watch the way they talk about Amy's disappearance as though it's an event that happened to their narrative rather than to their child. Watch how quickly, what does this mean for the books, sits beneath where is our daughter, even when they're not saying it out loud. Watch the authors who authored their child, discovering that the story has outgrown their control. Watch Margot. Watch the one character in the film who genuinely, non-performatively loves Nick, who isn't constructing a story about him, who isn't responding to a version of him she wrote in her head, who just loves her brother. Watch how helpless this makes her in the film's logic. Her love is authentic. Her love is therefore useless. She can't save him because she's not a story. She's a person. And in the world Gone Girl depicts, persons don't have the leverage that stories do. Watch the media. Watch how Ellen Abbott's audience isn't cruel, not exactly. They're not monsters, not sadists. They're story consumers. They want the narrative resolved. They want the ending. They were promised. They are, in their hunger for resolution, in their certainty about Nick's guilt, in their passionate investment in a woman they never met. They are the most honest representation in the film of what we all are when we're consuming stories about other people's lives. And then watch the final image. Amy and Nick, the camera pulling back, slowly, the frame widening, the two of them growing smaller, The house around them become invisible. The world outside the house become invisible. The story they are inside become invisible as a story. Contained, framed, authored, and then the cut to black. The story ends because the film ends, but not because the thing itself ends. The thing itself doesn't end. The story just stops being visible to us. The prison continues beyond the frame, and somewhere in that darkness, Amy is already writing the next chapter. The final argument. Here's the most provocative version of the thesis. In its baldest form, we have been arguing about Gone Girl for a decade, because we are inside Gone Girl. We are inside the story the film warned us about. Every argument about whether Amy is a feminist hero or a misogynist nightmare, every think piece about the cool girl monologue, every TikTok performing her dialogue, every podcast dissecting the film's gender politics. We have been giving Amy Dunne exactly what she always wanted. We have been writing her story. We have been maintaining her narrative. We have been, without knowing it, the mechanism by which the story stays alive and continues to consume. The film knew we would do this. The film is built for us to do this. The story that catches you is the one you can't stop arguing about. And Gone Girl built an argument that cannot be resolved on the terms on which it's usually conducted, which means the argument continues, which means the story continues, which means the story wins. This isn't a criticism of the film. It's a description of its genius. Gillian Flynn and David Fincher built a narrative trap that catches its audience the same way Amazing Amy caught Amy, the same way Amy's diary caught The Police, the same way Amy's performance caught DC. You engage with the story, you take a position in the story, and then the story has you, not in a vague, metaphorical way. In the precise, structural, architectural way that the film depicts, you are now a character in the narrative of Gone Girl's cultural reception, and you will be characterized as feminist, as misogynist, as sophisticated, as overthinking critic based on the position you take. You're in the diary. You always were. The only way out is to stop asking, what is Amy Dunne? And start asking, what does my need to answer that question tell me about the world I'm living in? Go ask that question. Then watch the film again. Everyone walked out of the theater talking about Amy. Of course they did. Rosamund Pike's performance is staggering. Amy's plan is operatic in its precision. The reveal is one of the best engineered twists in mainstream American cinema of its decade. Amy demands your attention, earns it, and keeps it with the relentless force of a character who refuses to be ignored. She is, in every conventional metric of cinematic impact, the film. And because of this, because Amy is so thoroughly, so deliberately, so engineered to be the thing you're watching, Nick Dunne has been almost completely misread for 10 years. Critics split on Nick the way they split on Amy. The feminist camp found him contemptible, the embodiment of male obliviousness and entitlement, a man who never saw his wife because he never thought to look. The more sympathetic camp found him tragic, a man blindsided by a level of pathology no ordinary person could have anticipated. Some found him likably schlubby, a Ben Affleck in his natural register, charming but hollow, likable but vacant, the guy at the party who'd rather be somewhere else. None of these readings are wrong exactly. They're just answering the easy question about Nick. The hard question, the one that makes Nick not just a character in a thriller but the film's most philosophically disturbing presence, is not what kind of husband was Nick, or is Nick guilty, or even does Nick love Amy? The hard question is, by the end of the film, Nick knows everything about what Amy did, and he stays. Why? Not why can't he leave. That question has tactical answers: the pregnancy, the public narrative of reunion, the impossibility of proving Amy's crimes. Those are real constraints. The harder question is, does Nick actually want to leave? Because the film, if you watch it carefully, if you watch Nick carefully, which almost nobody does, because Amy is always in the frame demanding you watch her, the film suggests, quietly and devastatingly, that the answer is no. Nick Dunne, by the end of Gone Girl, has become the most disturbing figure in the film, not because he's a villain, not because he's a victim, because he is something rarer and more unsettling than either. A man who has looked directly into the mechanism of his own captivity, understood it completely, and decided, consciously, in full possession of the facts, that the story is worth staying inside. This proves the thesis in its most complete form. The film's argument about narrative as a totalitarian force is not just that narrative traps people against their will. It's that narrative, once sufficiently immersive, sufficiently vivid, sufficiently authored with the precisionly authored with the present chooses, the prison that starts as captivity ends as home. And that transformation, that moment when the prisoner stops rattling the bars and starts decorating the cell, is the most complete expression of narrative violence that Gone Girl offers. Amy is in the horror. Amy is the mechanism of the horror. Nick is the horror. The man who looked. Let's establish what Nick actually knows by the film's final act, because there's a tendency in discussions of the ending to soften this, to treat Nick's decision to stay as a kind of fog, a confusion, an inability to fully process what he knows. This is wrong. Nick is not confused. Nick knows that Amy fabricated a diary over a period of months, planting false evidence of his abuse and escalating violence with forensic precision. He knows that she purchased and planted the credit card evidence implicating him in financial ruin. He knows that she staged her own murder, used her own body as a crime scene, left her own blood on her own kitchen floor with the cold-blooded calculation of a set designer. He knows she hid in rural Missouri, deliberately degraded her own circumstances, then executed a pivot to Desi Collins' lake house with the timing of a chess grandmaster. He knows she seduced Desi using a character she built specifically to match his desire. He knows she fabricated a sexual assault, violated her own body to create forensic evidence, and murdered a man who loved her in order to construct a narrative of rescue and return. He knows all of this when Amy walks back through their front door in the film's final act. He knows it while the cameras roll. He knows it while he holds her. He knows it when he whispers into her hair that he knows what she did, and Amy knows that he knows, and Nick knows that Amy knows that he knows. And in that layered, recursive mutual awareness, they stand in their kitchen, and the film gives you a close-up of Nick's face, and you have to look very carefully. You have to look past the horror and the performance of horror to see what's actually there. Oh, not just fear, not just resignation, something that looks, in the precise geography of Ben Affleck's performance, like involuntary, helpless awe. He has been living with this woman. He thought he knew her. He thought at various points that she was impossible, infuriating, cold, brilliant, gone. What he never thought, what he never once considered, was the scale of her, the depth of the plan, the extraordinary, terrible, sustained intelligence required to execute what she executed. Nick Dunne is a writer who stopped writing, a craftsman who ran out of material, a man who spent years feeling like the least interesting person in his own life, and standing in his kitchen, in the ruins of his life, knowing everything Amy did, he is in the presence of the most extraordinary story he has ever been inside, and part of him, the part that wanted to be a writer, the part that was drawn to Amy's mind before he was ever drawn to her body, the part that is still underneath everything, a person who responds to narrative with the helpless receptiveness of the deeply literary. That part is not horrified. That part is riveted. The book he'll never write. There's a scene near the end of the film, quiet, brutal, shot almost in passing, where Nick tells Amy that he's gonna write a book about her, that he's gonna tell the world the truth, that he has the one weapon she can't take from him, language. It's presented as a threat. It's presented as Nick's declaration of independence, his claim to the authorial position, his refusal to remain solely a character in Amy's story. He will write, he will tell the truth, he will expose her. And this threat, if he followed through on it, would be the definitive act of narrative liberation. The man who was written about, who was the passive object of Amy's diary, the accused figure in Amy's story, the character in the media narrative of the missing wife, writing back, claiming the pen. This is what freedom looks like in the film's logical framework. Not living, not law enforcement. Writing. He doesn't do it. We know he doesn't do it because, by the film's end, Nick and Amy are still together, the pregnancy has been announced, the public story of their reconciliation is intact. A book exposing Amy would detonate all of this. He knows it would. And he chooses the story over the exposure. You could read this as cowardice. Most readings do. Nick is too frightened of what Amy might do if he acts against her, too trapped by the pregnancy to risk the destruction of the family narrative, too aware of how easily she could produce a counter-narrative that would destroy him if he tried to go public. These constraints are real, but they're not sufficient to explain the choice, because Nick isn't a stupid man. Nick knows, as clearly as he knows everything else, that remaining in this marriage is also a form of danger. The pregnancy is another leash, not a guarantee of safety. Amy's control is not going to diminish because he cooperates with it. The tactical calculation doesn't cleanly favor staying. What actually happens in the decision not to write the book is this, Nick realizes, in the same moment that he articulates the threat, that following through on it would end the story. It would give the story a resolution, a newspaper headline, a courtroom, a verdict, an ending. And endings, for the story saturated, the deeply literary, the people who live more intensely inside narratives than outside them. Endings are what you fear most. Because after the ending, there's nothing. The flat, narrative-free territory of ordinary life. The life Amy always feared. The life Nick, having now been inside Amy's story, can no longer imagine returning to. The book Nick threatens to write is the book that would free him. He doesn't write it because freedom, in this context, means living the most interesting story he's ever inhabited. He's not too frightened to write it, he's too addicted to not write it. The problem. Here's where the counter-argument lives, and I want to address it before moving on. You're probably thinking, this is too generous to Nick, characterizing his decision to stay as addiction to the story, aestheticizes and excuses his complicity in a deeply abusive dynamic. Nick is staying with a woman who murdered someone, who framed him for murder, who has demonstrated a total willingness to destroy any person, including him, who stopped serving her narrative. Calling this awe and literary addiction is a way of making Nick's passivity sound interesting rather than what it actually is, the behavior of an abuse victim who has been so thoroughly manipulated that he cannot identify the exit. This is a serious objection. Let me engage it fully. There's genuine truth in the abuse reading. The tactics Amy deploys throughout the film, isolation, reputation distraction, manufactured dependency, the systematic dismantling of Nick's capacity for independent action, are textbook coercive control. And coercive control produces exactly the kind of apparent choice that Nick makes at the end. The victim who stays not because they're physically prevented from leaving, but because the abuser has restructured their entire sense of what's possible, what's desirable, what they deserve. So yes, the abuse reading is available, and it is not wrong. But here's what the abuse reading cannot account for: Nick's moments of clarity. Nick, unlike the typical portrait of an abuse victim, has extended, articulate, uncontested moments of clear-eyed knowledge of what Amy is and what she has done. He tells Margot everything. He tells his lawyer everything. He tells Amy directly in the kitchen that he knows what she did, not as a confrontation designed to produce a confession or a resolution, but as a simple statement of fact between two people who have no more illusions about each other. These are not the behaviors of a person who has lost the capacity to see the situation clearly. They are the behaviors of a person who sees the situation clearly and remains anyway. The abuse reading says he can leave. The film says he doesn't leave. The distinction matters enormously. One is captivity, the other is choice, a specific, terrible, fully conscious kind of choice that the film refuses to dress up as anything simpler. Nick is not just an abuse victim. Nick is an abuse victim who has arrived, by the film's end, at something approaching a philosophy of his own captivity. He has thought it through. He has looked at the exit and looked at the story and looked at the exit again, and the story won. Not because the story threatened him into staying, because the story, for Nick Dunne, is more real than the exit. This is the more disturbing reading, and the film earns it by making Nick intelligent enough that you cannot write off his decision as incapacity. Whatever we want, return to the exchange that the thesis named as the film's philosophical center. What are we doing? Whatever we want. You've been to Module 6 now. You've had the thesis unpacked, so read this exchange again with everything you now know. Nick asks, what are we doing? This is not despair. This is not rhetorical resignation. Watch Affleck's delivery. It's close to wonder. It's the question of a person who has arrived somewhere unexpected and is genuinely trying to understand the geography. He's not asking, how did this happen to us? He's asking, what is this? What is this thing we're in? What do we call it? What are the rules? Amy answers, whatever we want. And this is Amy's most honest statement in the entire film. Not because they actually can do whatever they want. They're constrained by the pregnancy, the public narrative, their mutual assured destruction, but because Amy is describing the nature of their relationship as it now exists with total accuracy. They are, for the first time, genuine co-authors. Nick knows everything. Amy knows he knows everything. Neither can destroy the other without destroying themselves. The narrative equilibrium they've reached is, genuinely, a kind of freedom. Not freedom from the story, but freedom within the story. They can write whatever they want now, because they're the only two people who know the story is fiction. In that exchange, Nick stops being Amy's character. He becomes her collaborator. And the question the film leaves hanging, the question it refuses to resolve, is whether this is tragedy or something else. Whether the collaborative authorship of a shared life, even a life that is fundamentally performed, even a life that was born in violence and sustained by mutual threat, is categorically worse than the alternative. Whether the authentic, unperformed life Nick might have had outside his marriage, the ordinary life, the honest life, the book he might actually have written, would have been richer or simply emptier. Gone Girl doesn't answer this. It won't. Because answering it would mean taking a position on whether the story is worth the violence it requires. And the film knows, with the precision that only genuinely great films achieve, that this is a question each viewer has to answer for themselves. But the question is not rhetorical. It has stakes, because the world Nick inhabits at the end of Gone Girl, the world of mutual performance, collaborative narrative, the couple as co-authors of a shared fiction, is not unique to this marriage. It is a recognizable description of how many long-term relationships actually function, once the initial authenticity of early romance has been replaced by something more managed, more deliberate, more conscious of its audience. Nick stayed because the story was better than no story. You may find that horrifying. You may find it comprehensible. The film is waiting, with perfect patience, for you to decide which, and watching carefully to see what your answer reveals about you. The accomplice's testimony. There's a final thing to say about Nick, and it's the thing that seals him as the most disturbing figure in the film, rather than merely the most overlooked. Nick is the only character who could have ended the story, not Amy. Amy needs the story. She is the engine of it, the author of it, but she cannot end it, not voluntarily, because ending it would mean the end of her authority, her project, her reason for existing in the precise shape she inhabits. She is the story the way a spider is its own web. She can't exit without dissolving, but Nick could end it. He has enough information to at least damage it. He has Margot. He has his lawyer. He has Go's unconditional loyalty and a clearer view of Amy's crimes than anyone in the film possesses. He has the capacity, if not the certainty, to make enough noise that the story becomes untenable. He chooses instead to become the story's co-author. And in making that choice, he does something to the story that Amy, for all her control and precision, could never have done alone. He legitimizes it. A story that only one person knows is a story. A story that both parties knowingly sustain is a world. Nick's participation transforms Amy's narrative from a unilateral fabrication into a shared reality. He doesn't just stay in the story, he co-signs it. He makes it real in a way it couldn't be when only Amy knew what it was. This is the accomplice's role, not to plan the crime, to authenticate it, to stand next to it in public and say, with his silence and his presence and his hand around Amy's waist, yes, this is what happened. This is what we are. This story is true. Every story needs a witness to become reality. Nick is Amy's witness. He provides the external validation that transforms her constructed narrative from performance into fact. Without him, Amy is a woman telling a very convincing lie. With him, with his knowing, conscious, voluntary presence, she's a woman living a very compelling truth. The accomplice is always more dangerous than the criminal. The criminal acts, the accomplice affirms. And in a film whose central argument is that narrative becomes real the moment enough people agree to treat it as real, the character who provides that agreement is the character who makes the whole horror possible. Nick Dunne doesn't destroy Amy Dunne's story. He makes it the only story there is. And he does it with his eyes open. Which means, by the film's logic, by the thesis that has been building since the opening voiceover about cracking open a skull to find the story inside. Nick Dunne is not Amy's prisoner, he is her reader. And readers, in the world Gone Girl depicts, are the most complicit people of all. Here is something that should bother you. Amy Dunne, the woman who spent an entire film fighting the reduction of her person to a symbol, who murdered to escape a story written about her, who built an elaborate lethal apparatus specifically to prevent the world from turning her into a character, is now a Halloween costume. She's a reaction, GIF, she's a TikTok sound, she's a girl boss, meme. She's a shorthand for female cunning on dating forums, a Pinterest aesthetic, a personality type in comment sections. I'm not like other girls, I'm Amy Dunne. She's been reclaimed, ironized, merchandised, and deployed as a cultural reference point by millions of people who have never watched the film and thousands more who watched it and understood it as a celebration of the very thing it was diagnosing. She became Amazing Amy. Not metaphorically, literally. Amy Dunne, the fictional person, the character constructed by Gillian Flynn and inhabited by Rosamund Pike, was authored by the culture that consumed her into a simplified, commercially legible, narratively convenient version of herself. The culture took the raw material of her complexity and published a better, cleaner, more usable version of it. The messy, philosophically disturbing, genuinely threatening Amy Dunne of the film was replaced by the Amy Dunne that cultural consumption required. The queen, the icon, the girl boss anti-hero, the woman who got away with it. This is not irony, it's not coincidence, it's the thesis completing its proof in the only arena where it could be fully tested, reality. Gone Girl argued that narrative is a totalitarian force that colonizes everything it touches, that no person, however self-aware, however skilled, however ruthless, can fully escape the story others tell about them. And then, Gone Girl itself was consumed by exactly the apparatus it depicted. The film that argued against narrative colonization was narratively colonized. The character who fought to remain uncharacterizable was characterized, packaged, and sold. The story ate the story. This is modulate. This is the inheritance. Not what Gone Girl left us with thematically. The previous 7 modules have covered that. What Gone Girl left us with culturally. What the world did with it. What we did with it. And what that doing reveals about the world we are now living in. A world that, in 2026, has become so thoroughly the world. Gone Girl depicted that the film reads less like a thriller and more like a training manual that arrived just before the course began. What the culture did with Amy. Let's be specific about the transformation, because the specifics matter. In 2014, when Gone Girl released, the cultural reception was divided and uncomfortable. Critics argued genuinely about whether the film was feminist or misogynist. The discomfort was productive. It meant the film's actual argument was landing, at least partially. People were unsettled. They didn't know what to do with Amy. They couldn't categorize her cleanly. She resisted the available boxes. The discomfort was the film working. By 2018, something had shifted. The cool girl monologue had been extracted from the film and circulated as a standalone text, quoted in tweets, referenced in essays, used as a rallying cry in conversations about gender performance that had nothing to do with murder. The monologue, divorced from its context, became a feminist anthem. Amy became a feminist icon, not the complicated, philosophically specific feminist argument the film made, the argument that even self-aware performance is performance, that narrative captures everyone including the people who see through it, but a simpler, more usable feminist story. Woman refuses impossible standards, woman fights back, woman wins. That's not what the film says. The film says, woman fights impossible standards by deploying a different impossible standard. Woman wins the battle and loses the war. Woman is still inside the story at the end. The story is still winning. The feminist icon reading requires you to stop the film at the moment Amy gets away with it and treat that as the ending. But the actual ending, the final shot, the pregnancy, the recursive trap, the story settling into its permanent configuration, contradicts every triumphalist reading. Amy doesn't win. She achieves equilibrium inside the prison. That's not winning. That's just a more comfortable cell. By 2004, the film's 10th anniversary, Amy Dunne had completed her transformation into the thing she most feared. She was an archetype, a shorthand, a cultural reference point that communicated a simplified idea. Clever, ruthless woman who refuses to play by the rules with the efficiency of a logo, the actual complexity of the character, the amazing Amy backstory, the narrative horror argument, the way the film implicates the audience in the violence it depicts had been metabolized and discarded. What remained was the usable part, the icon, the costume. The culture did to Amy Dunne exactly what Rand and Maribeth Elliott did to Amy Elliott. They published her. They made her better. They made her legible. They took the complicated, dangerous, resistant reality and turned it into a story that served their purposes. And in doing so, they proved every single thing the film argued. The true crime inheritance. There's a more direct line of descent to trace, because Gone Girl didn't just seed a cultural archetype. It dropped into a specific media ecosystem that was, in October 2014, at a precise moment of transformation. And the transformation it underwent in the following decade is a direct expression of the film's thesis playing out at industrial scale. The true crime genre, as a mainstream entertainment category, essentially launched the same month as Gone Girl. Serial, the podcast that turned a real criminal investigation into a serialized narrative product, premiered in October 2014. Within 5 years, true crime had become one of the most consumed entertainment genres in American media. Hundreds of podcasts, dozens of Netflix documentaries, the Making a Murderer phenomenon, the Tiger King phenomenon, the explosion of docuseries built on real human suffering, edited and scored and structured to deliver the pleasures of narrative, tension, revelation, catharsis. That reality itself refuses to provide cleanly dirty Ellen Abbott. The Nancy Grace analog in Gone Girl was not a satire of an extreme pathology. She was a preview of a mainstream business model. The true crime industrial complex that now generates billions in revenue is precisely the apparatus Gone Girl depicted, the transformation of real people's worst experiences, murder, disappearance, violation, loss, into story products for consumption. The victims in true crime documentaries are, structurally, in Amy's position. They are real people who have been narrativized by someone else, for someone else's purposes, shaped into characters that serve the story the producers want to tell. Their authenticity, their complexity, their resistance to clean characterization. These are problems to be edited around. The story requires a victim who fits the story. The person who was actually victimized is raw material. This is not a metaphor, this is the actual mechanism of the genre. And the audience for that genre, the tens of millions of people who genuinely care about justice, who feel real empathy for real victims who are engaged and moved and want resolution. That audience is doing exactly what Ellen Abbott's viewers do in the film. They are consuming a real person's life as a narrative product. They are demanding the story. And the demand is what makes the apparatus run. Gone Girl saw this coming. It saw it clearly. In 2014, before the genre explosion it was previewing. And it made its argument not just about the then current appetite for missing white woman stories, but about the structural inevitability of that appetite intensifying. Because the appetite is not a cultural accident. It is the logical consequence of a world that has taught everyone, from childhood to social media, through personal branding, through the omnipresence of narrative as the dominant framework for organizing human experience, that stories are how we understand people. That narrative is how we know. That without the story, the person is illegible. Once that belief is sufficiently installed, the demand for stories about real people becomes insatiable. Because real life keeps producing people who haven't been storied yet. Real life keeps producing complexity that hasn't been resolved into narrative yet. And the true crime apparatus exists to resolve it, to take the raw, resistant, genuinely complex material of real human experience and produce a story that makes sense. Amy's Diary at industrial scale with a subscriber count. The personal brand economy. But the true crime apparatus, for all its scale, is at least an external thing. You can choose not to listen to the podcast. You can choose not to watch the documentary. You can maintain, at least theoretically, some critical distance from the apparatus that turns other people's lives into your entertainment. The thing you cannot maintain distance from. The thing that has made Gone Girl's thesis not just culturally resonant, but personally inescapable, is the personal brand economy. In 2014, personal branding was still primarily the language of marketing departments and career coaches. By 2026, it is the organizing logic of professional existence. You need a LinkedIn presence. You need a professional narrative. A story about who you are, where you came from, where you're going, what you uniquely offer, that is coherent, engaging, and legible to strangers who will assess it in under 30 seconds. You need to build your story. You need to own your narrative. These are not optional enhancements for the especially ambitious. They are baseline requirements of professional participation in the contemporary economy. This is Amy's methodology, applied universally, without the self-awareness Amy brought to it. Amy knew she was constructing a character. She knew the diary was fiction. She was fully conscious of the gap between the performed self and the whatever exists beneath the performance. This consciousness was disturbing in the film. It was part of what made her feeling human, the way she held the performance at arm's length and watched it operate. But it was also, the thesis argues, the only honest relationship with the performed self available in the world the film depicts. The alternative to Amy's conscious performance is not authenticity. The alternative is unconscious performance, the person who builds their LinkedIn profile, curates their Instagram, crafts their dating app bio, rehearses their interview answers, and genuinely believes that what they're producing is just who they are. The personal brand economy has produced billions of people who are doing what Amy does without knowing they're doing it, who have authored a character, consistent, legible, professionally viable, emotionally appealing to their target audience, and then inhabited that character so thoroughly that the distinction between the character and themselves has become genuinely unclear. Who would, if asked, which is the real you, the LinkedIn you, or the you at 3 a.m., struggle to answer without anxiety? Amazing Amy was a horror when it happened to one child, authored by her parents without her consent. It is the condition of professional existence when it happens to everyone, authored by platform incentives with the illusion of consent. Gone Girl in 2014 was a film about a pathological extreme. Gone Girl in 2026 is a film about Tuesday, the deepfake terminus. And then there's the technology. Amy's diary was a fabrication that used the formal conventions of authentic documentation, handwriting, chronology, first-person voice, emotional specificity to produce a narrative that was indistinguishable from truth. The police believed it. The public would have believed it. Its power derived from the fact that the form of authenticity is, in practical terms, sufficient to produce the effects of authenticity. You don't need real experience. You need the grammar of real experience. In 2026, the technology to fabricate the grammar of authentic experience has become democratized to the point of universality. Audio deepfakes, video deepfakes, AI-generated images indistinguishable from photographs, language models capable of producing first-person narrative in any voice, any style, any emotional register with the specificity and texture that the human brain reads as genuine. The tools Amy spent months deploying by hand, the careful calibration of the diary's emotional arc, the strategic inclusion of specific details that would read as authentic rather than invented. These tools are now available to anyone with a phone and an internet connection, executable in minutes. Amy's diary was a masterwork of fabrication because it was hard. It required intelligence, sustained effort, intimate knowledge of her subject, and a controlled environment in which to execute it. The difficulty of the fabrication was part of what made it remarkable. The film marveled slightly at the sheer discipline required. That difficulty no longer exists as a meaningful barrier. This is not a digression from the thesis. This is the thesis at its terminus. Gone Girl argued that in a world where narrative is the dominant framework for understanding people, the ability to author a convincing narrative about a person is the ability to control how that person is perceived and, functionally, who that person is to everyone outside their own skull. Amy had that ability in 2014 because she was exceptional. In 2006, that ability is a picture on your phone, the world Amy diagnosed. The world where the story is more real than the person, where fabricated narrative and authentic narrative are distinguished only by their quality of construction, where the consumer of narrative has no reliable mechanism for distinguishing between them, that world has arrived. Not gradually, rapidly, with an acceleration that makes the original horror of Amy's diary feel almost quaint, almost artisanal. She made hers by hand. Now they make themselves. And the question the film was always really asking, what happens to truth in a world where narrative is the only available currency, is no longer a philosophical thought experiment. It is the operating condition of daily life. What Gone Girl made of us here is the accounting. Gone Girl gave us the cool girl discourse, a genuine, useful, culturally important vocabulary for naming a specific form of gender performance. That's a real contribution. It gave us Rosamund Pike's performance, which is one of the great screen performances of its decade. It gave us Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's score, which influenced a generation of thriller films. It gave us a new archetype, the intelligent female villain with philosophical depth. That seeded an entire wave of subsequent prestige entertainment. These are real gifts. They are also, every one of them, the culture doing to Gone Girl what Amy always feared would be done to her. Every reduction of the film to its cool girl speech is an act of narrative simplification. Every Rosamund Pike was robbed at the Oscars tweet is a response to a performance extracted from its meaning. Every subsequent morally complex female anti-hero who inherits Amy's archetype is the Amazing Amy franchise, extended. Gone Girl gave us things, yes. And in the giving, the culture metabolized the giver, what Gone Girl made of us, what it tried to make of us, what it was designed to make of us, what it would have made of us if we'd let it, was witnesses, not consumers, witnesses. There's a difference, and the film knows the difference, and the difference is the entire point. A consumer of Gone Girl watches the story, takes a side, forms an opinion about Amy, argues about gender politics, and walks away with a take. The story has been consumed. It produced an opinion, the transaction is complete. A witness to Gone Girl watches the story, and then watches themselves watching the story, and then asks, with the specific, uncomfortable, productive discomfort the film is engineered to produce, what does the fact that I have opinions about Amy Dunne tell me about the world I'm living in and the mechanisms by which that world has organized my responses? The witness doesn't resolve the film. The witness lets the film remain unresolved because the unresolved film is doing something that the resolved film cannot do. It's showing you, in the gap between the story's ending and your desire for the ending to mean something, the precise shape of your own narrative appetite. Most of us were consumers. The culture made consumption easy, made it rewarding, gave us the cool girl, G.I. Eve, and the Halloween costume, and the feminist icon framing, and the arguments in comment sections that let us participate in the story without ever examining our participation. The culture gave us Amy Dunne as a character to have opinions about, which meant we never had to look at ourselves as the audience Amy was always writing for. The witness position is still available. It's just harder to reach now that the culture has built so many comfortable entrances into the consumer position. It requires the specific act of resistance that the film's 7 previous modules have been building toward. The refusal to answer, what is Amy Dunne? In favor of why do I need to know? The only way out. There is no way out of the narrative. The thesis has been clear about this from the beginning. Amy couldn't exit. Nick couldn't exit. The culture couldn't exit. But there's a distinction. The film makes it, quietly, in every scene that contrasts Amy's conscious performance with everyone else's unconscious. 1. Between being inside the narrative and knowing you're inside the narrative. The distinction doesn't free you, but it changes your relationship to your captivity in ways that matter. Amy was inside narratives her entire life. What made her exceptional, what made her, depending on your reading, either a villain or the film's only honest character, was that she knew it. She didn't confuse the performance for the reality. She didn't mistake the character for the person. She maintained, at enormous psychological cost, the lucidity of someone who understands that every identity is constructed, every story is authored, every self is a character in someone else's narrative until you take the pen. The horror the film produces around Amy is the horror of encountering that lucidity in its raw and mediated form, without the social anesthesia that makes everyone else's performed selfhood comfortable to be around. We find Amy disturbing not because she performs, because she knows she performs. Her self-awareness is the thing we can look at directly, because it reflects back an awareness about ourselves that we'd prefer to keep submerged. The thesis isn't asking you to be Amy. The thesis is asking you to have the part of Amy that knows, without the part that murders, without the part that builds elaborate systems of revenge and control, without the part that has decided the story is worth any body count. Just the knowledge, the lucidity, the specific, uncomfortable, permanent awareness that the self you present to the world is a construction, that the story you tell about yourself is authored, that the narrative you inhabit was not entirely written by you and will not be entirely controlled by you, and that knowing this, really knowing it, not as an abstract theoretical position but as a lived daily awareness, is the only form of freedom the world Gone Girl depicts makes available. It's not the freedom Amy wanted. It's not freedom from the story. It's freedom within it. The freedom of the person who knows they're performing, who can watch the performance with a part of themselves that remains outside it, critical, clear-eyed, unwilling to mistake the character for the person, and who can therefore make choices about the performance rather than simply be the performance. Nick got there, in his terrible way, at the terrible price of everything. Margot had it instinctively. Detective Boney glimpsed it and didn't know what to do with it. Amy had it fully and completely and used it as a weapon. The film is offering it to you as a lens. Not a weapon, a lens. The last image. The film's final image, Amy and Nick, together, the camera pulling back slowly. The domestic space becoming visible around them. The house, the walls, the architecture of the life they built or that has been built around them. The frame widening until they're small inside it. The story made visible as a container. And then darkness. You've watched this ending multiple times probably, and you felt it as an ending, as the film closing around these two people. The story locking into its final configuration, the horror settling into permanence. Watch it again now. Watch it as a beginning. Because what the final image is showing you, if you watch it with the thesis in mind, if you watch it as a film about the violence of narrative rather than a film about a violent marriage, is not the closing of Amy and Nick's story. It's the opening of yours. The camera pulling back is not the film retreating from its characters. It's the film retreating from you, returning authorial control to the audience it has spent 2 hours examining. The darkness at the end of Gone Girl is not a conclusion. It's a question. Specifically, now that you watched this, now that you've been inside this story, now that you felt what it feels like to be the audience for someone else's fabricated narrative and to have your sympathies manipulated and your judgment compromised and your desire for resolution used against you, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Are you going to walk out of the darkness and immediately consume the next story? Are you going to open your phone and produce the next installment of your own author self? Are you going to keep reading other people's diaries and calling it understanding? Are you going to keep performing characters and calling it living? Or are you going to do the thing Amy could never do, the thing that would have saved everyone in the film, including Amy, including Nick, including Desi, including the entire apparatus of the Ellen Abbott industrial complex, which is to hold both things at once, the performance and the performer, the story and the person, the character and the human being underneath, and refuse to collapse one into the other? The film cannot make you do this. It can only show you what happens when nobody does. Nick couldn't do it until it was too late. Amy couldn't do it at all. She replaced one story with another and called it freedom. The culture that consumed the film certainly couldn't do it, as 10 years of reductive takes and Halloween costumes and girl boss reclamations have definitively proven. But you're watching now. You've spent however long it took you to get through this essay watching a film about what story does to people. You've watched it from the outside. You had the mechanism explained. You've seen the prison's architecture in the frame structure, in the score, in the performance choices, in the recursive trap of the ending that mirrors the beginning. You know what the prison is made of. The last thing Gone Girl leaves you with, not the image, not the music, not the thesis, is a simple, small, permanently uncomfortable piece of knowledge. Stories are not truth. People are not characters. And every time you demand a narrative about someone, every time you insist on understanding a person through the story they tell, or the story others tell about them, or the story the algorithm constructs from their behavior, you are doing what the film warned you about. You are cracking open a skull to read the story inside. The violence isn't in Amy's hands. It was always in the desire. It is always in the desire. And you have it. We all have it.